this land. They raised up the loggers, they mothered the mines, fostered fishermen and trappers on down the line. They sweated and they toiled, their laundry they boiled, they birthed and they bore it, and they rose to each chore.
From 1915 to 1945, World Wars I and II, new laws affecting our place in society, the growth of trade unions, and the Great Depression of 1929. The women portrayed here are those who lived in isolated logging and fishing communities on Northern Vancouver Island, and who eventful everyday lives that were not so exciting. However, who made settling on the North Coast feasible and inspired the generations that followed. What better way to honor the courageous lives of our foremothers than by capturing their living memories in photographs, letters, diaries, and stories. These stories of mainly white women take us from childhood and proceed to the early years of marriage. With the larger community was critical for these women who lived in isolation. Stories of childbirth, child-rearing, and schooling will help to portray the hardships and the joys of this life. A description of women's work, the important contributions that were made. For a number of women, the stories begin when their parents made the decision to move to a coastal community, often in search of consistent work, and not always foreseeing the hardships the family would endure. Recalls leaving Victoria in 1915 at the age of 11, accompanied by her parents and 3-year-old sister on a small steamer ship called the Tees. Along with the family members, Captain Peterson allowed 1 goat, some chickens, and a dog to help start the family off on their new land. It was a rough and miserable trip up the west coast of Vancouver Island to Winter Harbour in Quatsino Sound, arriving at night by small launch at San Joseph Bay. The life of Mary Jeffrey, who ventured sight unseen to Cortes Island, is chronicled in the memoirs written by Etta Byers entitled A Lady to Remember. Mary and her husband Henry traveled to the island with their 6 children in 1925, believing it was an ideal place to raise a family. They arrived on the Union steamship, not knowing anyone on the island, nor how to find their new homestead. When the family reached their destination, Mary was puzzled. Where was the grocery store? Her only neighbor told her to send an order to Woodward's in Vancouver, and the goods would arrive the following week. Getting the groceries home from the dock at Seaford was another story again. For those who moved into logging camps, there was a sense of community, but the transition from city homes to primitive houses or tents was challenging. For Lillian Carroll's mother, the move from her uptown home in Halifax, Nova Scotia, to remote Jackson Bay presented her with a marked contrast. The recently remarried widow moved with her new husband and daughter to another world of forest and one of the first married women to move into a logging camp, making her home with husband Spooley in one of the International Timber Company's tent camps. The thin canvas tents barely muffled a whisper, let alone the cry of their baby, a fact gruffly pointed out by the neighboring loggers. "Spooley, keep that baby quiet." Young women were first introduced to logging camp life as a result of World War I and the shortage of young men in the labor pool. Reluctantly, management contracted with employment agencies in the cities to send young women into the camps. Gertie Couchet, born in 1900, said, "A lot of women went to work that would never have gone if it hadn't been for the war. They had such a time with the men flunkies. The superintendent said he wasn't in favor of having girls in the dining room. It was the best thing he ever did. He said the dining room is clean, the tables are clean, and he said the food is clean." However, history tells us that women influenced more than cleanliness and meals in the camps. In 1918, the State of Washington Bureau of Labor noted that 90% of men in logging camps were unmarried and their employment was intermittent. Labor turnover was 600%. Labor unrest was not due to low wages or unsanitary conditions, but due to the absence of family life. In a book on the history of Campbell River, Helen Mitchell noted the era of the 3-week willies, or jobs, because there was no family life in the camps. The married women who lived along the coast opened their homes to single men and extended whatever comforts they could offer to new arrivals, with a welcoming hearth, a crucial ingredient for ensuring that a rooted, non-transient population took hold. Despite creating the sense of community for others, the women themselves often described feelings of loneliness and isolation.
Because I knew when I was bushed, if I sat and we had, in later years, had the TV, but we only had one station. But if I was sitting alone and I would, suddenly cry for no reason, the TV could be playing a good play, but it wasn't interesting to me. I felt lonely. You couldn't be alone 3 or 4 days at a time and not need the outside company. Should have got used to it, but after 14 years, I don't know, I should have got used to it. But I didn't seem to. You always had to have the, I think it was the lack of women that was moaned, yeah. That woman's companionship, you needed that.
For some, the only way to see other people was to take a rowboat, and with numerous young children, this was difficult. Isolation resulted in what was called, in those days, bad nerves. Given the isolation and loneliness, what did the women do to build social bridges? Numerous women as a way of coping with the isolation. Reaching out to other women was done through women's groups, such as the Lighthouse Circle, the IODE, the Women's Institute, and even team sports. The local church was often the place for meetings that evolved around community service, sewing, or planning special events. These social events were an occasion for getting together with distant neighbors. The effort to attend dances or celebrations despite long boat rides or unpredictable weather highlights the importance that women placed on these events.
This country, they say, was made by the men, but the West Coast was won by their women. Oh, courage has beauty, and they wore it that way. In hand with their man, they came to this land. They raised up the loggers, they mothered the mines, fostered fishermen and trappers on down the line.
The need to gather together was natural for most women. Even in sparsely populated areas like San Joseph Bay, women strived to meet often through groups such as the Women's Institute. The Women's Institute, a vast organization of country women, ran under the motto "For Home and Country." Between 1914 to 1918, this organization was actively engaged in war work of all kinds, knitting for the Red Cross, supporting the Patriotic Fund, and helping their communities whenever possible. World issues and political concerns were also topics of interest for some of the institutes. Guest speakers, such as Helen McGill, a juvenile court judge, were invited to educate women regarding their legal rights. In 1917, women were finally granted the right to vote in BC, along with the right to sit as members of the provincial legislature. Laws that followed this landmark decision included those that allowed women's membership on school boards, protection of women's rights to shared guardianship of children and to family estate, and legal recognition of their rights in industrial settings. Helen McGill's publications on women's changing rights were studied carefully by numerous Women's Institute groups. During the Depression, thousands of men were sent to relief camps, which imposed extreme hardship on their families. In some cases, families were broken apart, with children going into orphanages. Women used their newfound activism skills, accrued over the preceding years of working toward voting rights, to rally for the abolition of these relief camps. For more than 60 years, the Union steamships provided a vital link for coastal communities, a link that bridged both emotional and physical isolation. Boat days were a festive occasion for communities, and all other activity shut down. Women on Cortes Island delight at memories of walking mile after mile on boat day to meet the steamship, leaving early in the morning and collecting friends along their way. Despite the excitement, boat day could also be disappointing or letter did not arrive, as one had to wait for another whole week. A trip to Vancouver on the steamship was a highlight. Peggy Newsham recalls that the return trip from Manson's Landing on Cortes Island to Vancouver was $7.75. There were linen tablecloths, china, glasses, silverware, waiters, and a place to sleep. A pillow and a blanket cost 25 cents, and you could sleep on the benches, as most of the men did. The half a dozen staterooms were reserved for women. This link was particularly important for women during pregnancy and childbirth.
You see, in those days, the doctor would say, he'd come on the Columbia Coast mission, and he would tell you that he wanted you to go to the Rock Bay Hospital, and you'd have to stay there a month, because you couldn't be out in the boonies and, wait for it to happen. You made beds, and you went to walk with these ladies every day, and each day there would be one that would have to go in and have the baby. But the other women, they, it gave you courage, and when you felt like you were afraid, which you were because it was your first baby, and you felt kind of scared, they were there to comfort, and they had their little babies, and you could hardly wait to get yours.
Some communities relied on midwives for the maternity care. Selma Salami remembers that at the Finnish community of Sointula on Malcolm Island, children who asked where babies came from were told, "Oh, they found it under the plank in the sauna." When I was expecting my first child at age 16, I wasn't even due yet, but I was telling my mother-in-law that my back had been sore all day. So she said, "Let's heat the sauna and you go sit in hot water." That finished it. I hardly got into the house, and the baby was born before the midwife got there. As families grew, limiting the number of children became a concern, especially when times were tough. Throughout the 1920s, desperate Canadian women wrote seeking contraceptive advice from the Birth Control Review, a journal published by Margaret Sanger. And in 1924, the Canadian Birth Control League was founded in BC. Many couples practiced the sometimes it's safe and sometimes it's not rule, but knowledge of contraception was limited and often incorrect. In rare cases, women traveled to the city for illegal abortions. However difficult this life may have been for women, they often acknowledged that it was a fine lifestyle for raising a family. Mothers had a great deal of time with their children, sharing the wealth of their homemaking skills. The outdoors offered a wide variety of activities, always tempered by the need to watch for their children's safety around the water. For those living on float houses or fish boats, life jackets were an everyday item of clothing that went on in the morning and didn't come off until bedtime. Boating accidents were another real possibility, as unpredictable weather and engines could put families at risk. Pansy Eddington recalls fishing from the family trawler in Ramsey Arm.
Waiting for fish to bite and trolling along. And then my little guy, he comes out of the cabin, because he always wore a life jacket. He never was allowed on the boat. That was a part of his dress wear. He would be mad if he didn't have it on. So anyway, he come out and he sat down on the deck, leaned like this, plunk, overboard he went. And here am I moving, we're trolling. And so I jumped down into the stern of the boat, and I thought, what can I do? All I can do is just be sensible, and as he passes by, you grab him. So this is what I did. I leaned over the boat like this and grabbed him out of the water.
Weathering a storm on the way back from Refuge Cove placed one mother in the unenviable position of trying to decide which of her 2 preschool children to rescue if the boat sank, as only her husband could swim. In addition to worrying about safety, women also had to concern themselves with ensuring health care for their families. Visiting a doctor might be a day's journey away, or if timed right, when the Columbia Coast Mission boat visited. Nancy Falk Hansen recalls the difficulty her family faced living in San Joseph Bay.
Because it was miles and miles to get to a doctor, all across these trails, I'm telling you, down to Holberg. And after you got there, then you had to take a boat. And that took you to Port Alice. But it took hours to get there as well. So if anyone was ill, it was pretty well hopeless.
Families became very self-reliant, with home remedies being a vital component of health care.
For sore throats and colds, we used to boil up onions, like with lemon and honey, and make a syrup with it, and that was really good. It's really soothing. But we didn't seem to get sick very often, probably because we ate stuff out in the bush, like spruce tips and salmonberry shoots and willow bark, and, you know, we were always nibbling on something out in the bush, and I think we all stayed healthy because of it.
Emergencies were difficult to deal with, as transportation to any kind of hospital was problematic.
One summer, 2 summers that he left us alone up there, I often think, I sit and I think about, now isn't that girls, 15, 13, and maybe 11, living up there in the open by themselves, no way of getting out of 40 miles of an inlet. What if we'd fallen down and broke our leg? What would we have done? But you know, that was never thought of. We just knew you could do it.
For those who lived in logging camps closer to town, access to health care could be more predictable. Converting a farmhouse to a 4-bed hospital, the Sisters of St. Joseph opened the hospital in Comox in 1913 to provide care for loggers injured on the job. Medical care was paid by the logging companies, with a premium coming off each man's wage to cover the costs. Town of headquarters, the doctor came every Wednesday and made house calls. When available, visiting nurses could come to various camps to give vaccinations. Lourdes Hospital in Campbell River opened in 1914. The hospital was taken over by the Sisters of St. Anne's in 1926, who operated it successfully until 1957, when the current hospital was built. Hospitals that were run by the nursing sisters were highly thought of for the standard of care that was provided. 1905 saw the start of the Columbia Coast Mission under the auspices of the Anglican Church. It was to become the largest marine mission on the coast, unique in its year-round, all-weather service, 3 hospitals, a traveling hospital ship, and a series of small ambulance ships. A good part of the mission's success was due to the social and educational links it created, including the circulating library and the monthly newsletter. The access to books and other materials was appreciated by women, as the challenge of educating their children fell to them. Those women who were camp cooks for their husbands' small private logging outfits were often teachers as well, and used the provincial system of education by correspondence, with weekly homework being sent to Victoria for grading. It was hard for parents to find several hours each day to give to the child's school lessons. Describing a typical day in a small float camp, Betty Landers listed the morning chores.
So to schedule my days was sometimes pretty rough. When I was teaching school to Donna and Betty, well, I would get up in the morning and I'd start my bread and then give them recess while I made the bread into loaves, and then school was over at noon. At one time I had 16 men to cook for. And packing all your water, it was not easy.
The province required a minimum of 10 children before providing a teacher in a community. Teachers such as Rose Bakey or Peggy Yetman were successful in securing their own teaching positions because they brought extra students with them, either younger siblings or children of their own. In larger communities, boarding students was a source of income for women, as well as a means of ensuring the school stayed open. Leaving school early in order to go to work was a disappointment for many of the women of this generation. Work meant helping their mother with the numerous younger children, or going out of the community for paying jobs. Alice Bundy remembers leaving business school in 1936 to care for her widowed mother who was dying of cancer. She became the owner-operator of the family business, the Willis Hotel in Union Bay, at the age of 19. For young women with limited education, paid work often consisted of being a mother's helper. Feeling at home in these live-in situations and getting along with the woman of the house was critical to a sense of belonging, especially when far away from home. Peggy Newsham was thankful to be working as a home help for Mrs. Robertson.
When I first went there, it must have been spring or something, Mrs. Robertson asked me to go and dig up her garden. Well, I didn't want to. I dug up everything. I didn't know asparagus for me. Oh, I dug up every darn thing. I didn't know you had to just dig these squares and things. She didn't say anything to me. She was a nice person to work for.
At age 14, Ilma Cook took a job at Alert Bay Hospital, helping the nurses, and was paid $15 per month for 10-hour days, 6 days a week. They had improved to $30 per month, plus 6 days a week. B. Halliday Gark describes her work at the hospital.
I started out doing what they call the in-between girl, and we did a little bit of everything. 2 days you worked on the wards, 2 days you worked in the kitchen, and so on, like that, making beds and whatever. Most of our emergency patients came in by boat. Some of them were touch and go whether they were going to make it even. Some didn't make it, but quite a lot of them did. 16 beds, all in 2 rows in the men's ward. You took your life in your hands sometimes going in there.
Times were tough for everyone, especially during the 1930s. Many women were fortunate to find work in the canneries, both the short-lived Comox Valley Fruit and Vegetable Cannery and the numerous fish canneries dotted along the coast. Eve Eade, a forelady with the Quathiaski Cove Canning Company, recalls, "We were glad to get a job during the Depression." In contrast to the typical industrial work camp, which employed mostly men, the camp villages that arose at the salmon canneries included women and children as workers. At the Quathiaski Cove Cannery, there was a crew of close to 50, including native and white women and Chinese men. The women trimmed the fish, packed it into cans, and were paid according to the number of trays they filled. The dress code for working in this cold, wet environment included hats to keep the hair in, yellow aprons that were waterproof, a white uniform dress, and rubber gloves. There were quite a few cut hands and fingers because those knives were like razors. The can edges were pretty sharp. You could wear out a pair of gloves in a day. The onset of World War II provided additional jobs for women, enlisting in the armed forces and working in the family business due to the lack of available men. For those women who enlisted, the war provided an opportunity to move out of their isolated communities for education and a career.
They trained all of us girls in that unit for the service corps to be truck drivers overseas, and we had to be trained as mechanics as well because we had to be able to do roadside repairs. I don't know yet how they expected some of us to lift up those great huge tires, but they did. They put me in the Ordnance Corps garage painting trucks. So I worked in Vancouver for these friends of mine actually owned this garage. It was employed all girls. There was no men. And I did pump gas and changed tires and repaired tires and did the normal. Well, I did work the grease pit as well, greasing cars and doing general motor work like changing oil and things.
The BC Women's Service Corps, which formed as a backup in case the war escalated onto Canadian soil, was another example of local opportunities. Women of good character were trained for hospital service, rescue work, and transportation. For 2.5 years, Mary Dingwall Mobley worked as a machinist, learning to operate a metal lathe, shaper, drill press, and hydraulic press. Other than a brief stint by her younger sister, Mary was the only woman in the Courtney machine shop, working alongside her father and brothers at a time when male employees were scarce. Mary and her sisters were also active in the Y Hostess Club, an organization in the Comox Valley that provided entertainment and support for soldiers away from home. Evelyn Sack's husband was a hand logger at Camp Point, and she worked alongside him. She did anything that needed to be done when the men weren't there. They had 3 to 5 men most of the time, and she cooked for them. Evelyn went out in the bush when the men went to war and worked until her son was born. Women, as the day was long. If the men worked away from home, the women not only had 24-hour responsibility for the children, but also the animals, the garden, and at times the family farm. Jean Feely recalls plowing the fields on their dairy farm while her husband was gone for the day earning a wage. Leona, her youngest child, would sit on her knee until she fell asleep and then be laid down in the corner of the field while Jean carried on with her work. At Kingcome Inlet, the Halliday family had a big dairy and mixed vegetable farm.
Yeah, we had a dairy. We were milking 30 cows there for a while, because I used to milk my share of them, like 10 at a time.
The necessity of putting their hand to many a task helped the women to be resourceful and make do with limited supplies. The Depression, the wars, and even forest fires forced families to make the best of difficult situations. Those women who lived on Northern Vancouver Island in 1922 and 1938 survived 2 devastating forest fires that destroyed homes and thousands of trees. They were thankful that on the north coast they could at least feed their families, while elsewhere in the country people went hungry. Some things were in short supply or unobtainable. Stocking shortages gave rise to the fashion of painting legs. The leg dye was harmless and washed off with warm water and soap, but did not rub off on other clothing. These, in fact, were the first seamless stockings. It was a necessity to make clothing out of old things. Once in her city life, Nancy Falk Hansen's mother had beautiful clothes, and she would reuse the fabric or create clothing from flour sacks.
So we used to buy the flour in great big sacks, 50 or 100-pound sacks, you know. So you got a lovely big piece of material. Well, she could make all kinds of clothes for us girls out of those things, you see, and dye them different colors, whatever you were having. So that by the time it was finished, it was quite a nice thing.
A recurring theme in the women's stories was their overall philosophy that you made the best of the situation. Everyone was struggling, so women really helped each other. Betty Landers, who lived in a float camp near Reed Island, described her feelings about it.
I wouldn't give up that life. That was an experience I don't think I wouldn't give it up. I mean, it brought out strengths in me that I didn't know I had. It taught me that if your kids had the sniffles or a cough or a fever, you don't panic. It's not the end of the world. Now, what are you going to do about it? You cool them down, you use a bath, you use logic.
It was the sharing of strengths and experiences with those around you that seemed to build courage. Writing about the life of a Jippo logger's wife, one woman reminds us that life was not easy, but you learned to accept heartbreak, hard work, loneliness, and you learned to live life to the fullest and share love and happiness with fellow men. I'm sure it made a better person of me. In these reflections of women's lives, we can see how their influence was essential to the development, prosperity, and character of Northern Vancouver Island. We are linked to our foremothers and are offered inspiration from their stories of how they overcame hardships, how they welcomed adventure, and how they found their own strengths and courage.
Courage has beauty, and they wore it that way. In hand with their man, they came to this land. They raised up the loggers, they mothered the mines, fostered fishermen and trappers on down the line. They sweated and they toiled, their laundry they boiled, they birthed and they bore it, and they rose to each chore. fishermen and trappers on down the line. They sweated and they toiled, their laundry they boiled, they birthed and they bore it, and they rose to each chore. Courage has beauty, and they wore it that way. In hand with their man, they came to this land. They raised up the loggers, they mothered the mines, fostered fishermen and trappers on down the line. This country, they say, was made by the men, but the West Coast was won by their women. Oh, courage has beauty, and they wore it